This video is about the history, logistics, and crimes of the most dangerous group of hackers in the world. They've gone by many names: Hidden Cobra, Guardians of Peace, the Nickel Academy. But their most infamous one is the Lazarus Group. The Lazarus Group has been operating since 2009. They've sabotaged hospitals, infiltrated movie studios, robbed banks, destabilized governments, and most recently, carried out the largest cryptocurrency heist ever recorded. But these attacks aren't random. Every single one of them points back to one unexpected place. To most people, North Korea is little more than a mysterious, impoverished country where people struggle for basic necessities, electricity is scarce, and internet access is practically non-existent. But law enforcement sees a very different side of North Korea. A nation home to the most organized, relentless, and dangerous group of state-sponsored hackers in the world. But how? How did North Korea build the most advanced cyber army on the planet? How do they train and recruit their operatives? What is their true goal? To understand the Lazarus Group is to solve a complex puzzle. Answering these questions requires piecing together clues from dozens of cybercrimes, the investigations that followed, and the global network of banks, philanthropists, casinos, and even influencers that support the Lazarus Group's operations. But when you finally connect the dots, you realize something deeply unsettling. The story is bigger than just a group of rogue hackers. This is the story of an entire nation, one whose tragic history has shaped it into the largest, most sophisticated criminal enterprise the world has ever known. North Korea is one of the world's least understood countries. Western media often paints it as a brutal authoritarian regime led by a dictator with godlike status, where mass censorship, hunger, and human rights abuses are all too common. While much of this is accurate, the deeper question, why, often falls under the radar. To understand the Lazarus Group, we must understand North Korea's complicated and tragic history too. Let's begin in Japan at 11:02 a.m. on August 9th, 1945. 6 days after the United States drops an atomic bomb over Nagasaki, Imperial Japan surrenders unconditionally. World War II is finally over. Korea, which had been unified under Japanese control for 35 years, is occupied by the Allied powers to help them transition out of colonial rule. The northern half of the peninsula is taken by the Soviet Union, the southern half by the United States, and their respective territories are divided along the 38th parallel, a perfectly straight, imaginary line which divides the peninsula roughly in half. The occupations are supposed to be temporary and friendly. The United States and Soviet Union were allies, but once the war ends, they have completely different visions for the future. And as they both race to cement their power across the world, Korea gets caught in the crossfire. In 1948, the 38th parallel transforms from an imaginary line into a border, and a once unified people are split into two rival nations: the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north and the Republic of Korea in the south. Tensions between them escalate immediately. While the South embraces capitalism, The Soviet Union installs a communist regime in the north, and at its helm is Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung is a completely different person depending on who's telling his story. Official North Korean propaganda paints him as a legendary freedom fighter who single-handedly led the resistance against the Japanese occupation. But historical records tell a different story. Kim was a resistance fighter, but more importantly, he is reliable, a communist, and easy to mythologize, the perfect puppet for the Soviet Union. Still, Kim had ambitions of his own. From the moment he takes power, he makes it North Korea's national mission to reunify the entire peninsula under communist rule. In 1950, he launches a surprise invasion, crossing the 38th parallel with around 75,000 troops. South Korean forces are overwhelmed and pushed into a tiny corner of the peninsula. It seems like Kim will fulfill his dream of reunification, but just as quickly as he advanced, the United States intervenes and launches a bold counterattack deep behind enemy lines. During air raids, the Americans destroy 85% of all buildings in the country, including homes, hospitals, and most critically, factories. By October, US and South Korean troops advance all the way to the Chinese border. Worried about having American forces on its doorstep, China sends hundreds of thousands of soldiers across the border and pushes the front line back. After 2 more years of bloody, exhausting warfare and over 2 million lives lost, the Korean War reaches a stalemate. The border between the North and South is virtually unchanged, except for the so-called demilitarized zone, one of the most heavily militarized places on Earth. To this day, technically, South Korea and its allies are still at war with North Korea. In the immediate aftermath, North Korea is in ruins. Millions of its people have perished, its infrastructure is rubble, and almost every major industrial building in the country has been destroyed. Kim Il-sung now has to rebuild this devastated nation from scratch, but he wastes no time in doing so. In the late 1950s and early 60s, Kim personally conducts over 1,300 on-the-spot inspections of new factories, mines, highways, housing units, hospitals, schools, and museums. According to official state propaganda, the economy is booming, and in fact, it's even outpacing the South. North Korea is bouncing back. It seems like a model of modern industrial socialism. But in reality, much of its growth is being propped up by generous loans from the Soviet Union. However, as the Soviet Union and China grow apart over ideological disputes about communism, Kim sides with China, the country that had backed him during the war. In response, the Soviets cut off their support, and cracks in the North Korean economy begin showing immediately. Kim is outraged at the notion of being economically reliant on another country, so in response, he creates a new ideology that reshapes North Korean society forever. Juche, which translates to self-reliance, calls for North Korea to achieve complete political, military, and economic independence from the outside world. It becomes the lens through which Kim makes every decision. He makes it increasingly difficult for anyone, even foreign allies, to come into or leave North Korea. He bans all foreign media, expels Soviet and Chinese advisors, halts food imports, and through relentless propaganda, he conditions the people to idolize him as a living god. As North Korea cuts itself off from the outside world, it earns itself a new nickname: the Hermit Kingdom. Juche is a noble idea to Kim Il-sung, but in practice, building a self-sustaining North Korean economy borders on the impossible. Aside from some coal, the country has few valuable natural resources. Nearly 80% of its land is mountainous and unsuitable for farming, even in ideal weather, which it does not have. Unsurprisingly, Juche cripples the economy. In just a few years, millions of North Koreans are surviving on meager food rations. But because of the regime's extreme censorship, most of them have no idea just how far behind they've fallen. Kim knows the truth, but he refuses to admit his failure. In public, he continues preaching the gospel of Juche, but behind closed doors, he does the complete opposite, borrowing billions again from the Soviet Union, China, and even France and Japan just to keep the country running. Meanwhile, South Korea is heading in the opposite direction. Foreign investment is flooding in, living standards are rising, and they're becoming a rising global power. Capitalism is clearly outperforming communism, especially in Asia. China is gradually shifting toward a more market-driven economy. It now trades more with South Korea than with the North. And as North Korea's coal reserves become harder to access, one of its last reliable exports begins to dry up, cutting off yet another stream of revenue. By this point, the only thing keeping North Korea going is financial support from the Soviet Union, its largest, oldest, and most important ally. But the Soviet Union has problems of its own. In 1991, it collapses, and overnight, food shortages in North Korea reach an all-time high. The regime blames the weather, or American sabotage, but the people receive no real explanation. Meanwhile, Kim Il-sung is living in luxury. Now in his late 70s, he's become obsessed with prolonging his life. He turns to pseudoscience and believes that the company of young women will help rejuvenate him. Some of his concubines are as young as 12. Kim Il-sung has ruled North Korea for nearly 50 years. He has outlasted 9 US presidents. In 1994, he dies at the age of 82, leaving his son, Kim Jong-il, in an impossible situation. The people are starving, the outside world is pulling away, and the economy is on the verge of collapse. North Korea is in desperate need of reform, but unfortunately, its fate had been sealed decades earlier. Back in the 1960s and 70s, Kim Il-sung had instructed the people to farm the country's hillsides to increase crop yields. It sounded like a practical idea. Use every piece of land to grow food. But to follow his orders, people cleared entire forests from the hills, and the land was never terraced or reinforced. It was unstable. In the summer of 1995, massive storms hit the Korean peninsula. Without trees to hold the soil in place, entire hillsides across all of North Korea collapse. Soil, crops, and debris rush into the rivers, clogging them. The resulting floods spread into more farmland, and even the country's coal mines, wiping out one of North Korea's last energy sources. With no other way to stay warm or cook, people begin cutting down more trees for firewood, which makes the deforestation worse, which makes the erosion worse, which causes more flooding. When more storms arrive, massive landslides bury entire villages. Hundreds of thousands of homes are destroyed. Crops fail, power fails, transportation fails. But this is only the beginning. The destruction of farmland triggers a full-scale famine. There is no food left. And without fertilizer or fuel from Russia, even the surviving farmland becomes unusable. The regime never publishes official numbers, but independent estimates suggest that somewhere between 240,000 and 3 million people die from those floods and the resulting famine. Even the North Korean elite aren't spared. The disaster touches every corner of the country. Kim Jong-il, new, unproven, and deeply insecure, is now facing the worst crisis in North Korean history. But his response only makes things worse. Desperate to maintain control, he fears that any sign of weakness could trigger a rebellion, so he doubles down on the only thing he believes can protect him: the military. Even as entire towns starve and hospitals run out of medicine, the military receives new weapons, new recruits, and new bases. It isn't until 1998, years into the famine, that North Korea finally allows the World Food Program into the country. What they find is unspeakable. Skeletal children, ghost towns, destroyed farmland, a broken nation on the very brink of collapse. And yet, somehow, despite the debt, the famine, the floods, the collapsed economy, the radical overspending on the military, the government still functions. It still pays back parts of its international debt. There isn't even too much inflation. By any conventional measure, this is nothing short of a miracle. North Korea had no real economy. No exports, no trade, no industry, no allies. The country should have collapsed, but it was still standing. Which raised one big question. How? At some point during this tragedy, or perhaps even before, North Korea changed. It stopped being a broken dictatorship and became something new entirely. You can't run a country, a global network of hackers, or a business without a way to track things. Thankfully, Odoo Project Management makes taking care of business easy. You can track tasks, deadlines, and work with others all in one place. Their intuitive interface takes the stress off executing complex workflows, and with their beautiful real-time dashboards, you always know exactly how your team is performing and make sure everyone has what they need. You can get started with Odoo Project Management for free, forever, with unlimited users. And when your business is ready to grow, Odoo has a full suite of business tools to manage your sales, marketing, and more. Try Odoo Project Management for free today using the top link in the description, or scan this QR code to get started. Thank you, Odoo, for sponsoring this video. In 1989, a cash handler at the Central Bank in the Philippines was sorting through a set of $100 bills when he had a gut feeling that something wasn't right. One of the bills, logged as C14342, was sent to the United States Secret Service for further inspection. At first, it seemed like just another counterfeit, one of millions the US seizes every year. But it wasn't. C14342 used the same paper, the same ink, and even came from the same printing press as an authentic $100 bill. There were only two discrepancies. On the front, a tiny gap between a line and the frame of Benjamin Franklin's portrait. On the back, a lamppost with a slightly thicker line at the base. The note was so convincing that the Secret Service gave it a nickname, the Superdollar. By 1993, more Superdollars had been discovered, not just in the Philippines, but in Japan, Iran, and Russia. And this posed a serious threat. If enough high-quality counterfeits made it into the global financial system, it could undermine the integrity of the dollar, disrupt trade, and even impact exchange rates. To the US government, this wasn't just a counterfeiting problem. It was a matter of national security. So in 1996, they introduced a complete redesign of the $100 bill with 8 new security features. However, the counterfeiters were quick to catch up. Within a few years, new Superdollars were on the market, and this time, they were even better. Under a magnifying glass, the hands on the bill's new clock tower were even sharper on the Superdollar than the ones on a genuine note. This wasn't the work of amateurs. Whoever was behind the Superdollar had the resources, equipment, and expertise to rival the US Treasury itself. As the authorities followed the trail, one name, one country kept coming up. In 1994, a New York bank had bought $280,000 in $100 bills from Banco Delta Asia, a bank based in Macau. Many of those notes turned out to be Superdollars, And when questioned, Banco Delta Asia pointed to a firm called Zokwang Trading. Zokwang operated out of a tiny office in a residential building in Macau. When journalists knocked on their door, on the walls were portraits of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il. The year after, a group of men had tried to sell $9,000 in fake $100 bills at a beach resort in Thailand. The police traced the bills to a fugitive Japanese terrorist who had hijacked a plane in the 70s and was granted asylum in North Korea, where he was treated as a hero. When the Thai police caught him, he was inside a Mercedes with 3 North Korean diplomats. In both of these cases, the authorities never gathered enough evidence to undeniably prove that North Korea was behind the Superdollar, but a theory was taking shape. North Korea, of course, prints its own currency, and they use the same make and model of printing press as many other countries. The machine wouldn't have been a problem, but US dollars are made with a proprietary cotton linen blend that's tightly controlled. Trying to source materials would immediately alert US authorities. To avoid this, North Korea may have bleached real $1 bills and reprinted them as $100. As for the ink, when the US redesigned the $100 bill in 1996, it introduced a new color-shifting ink, which they secured the exclusive right to. However, that same year, North Korea approached the company that made it, requesting to use a nearly identical one. Officially, this was to protect their own currency from counterfeiting. But no one counterfeits North Korean money. Instead, North Korea likely reverse-engineered the ink on the US dollar and modified theirs slightly to match it. One defector later told US officials that the counterfeiting was all done at government level. We had a special plant for it in Pyongyang. We bought the best equipment, the best ink, and we had the best people, real experts. Once the bills were ready, they were likely handed off to couriers who would smuggle them out of the country, sell them, and return with real cash. Fake money out, real money in. And it worked. As the operation spread beyond North Korean diplomats to ex-KGB agents, IRA operatives, and even petty criminals, millions in counterfeits began turning up across the globe. Not just in black markets, but increasingly inside legitimate banks, cash processing centers, and by the early 2000s, even on American soil. The US realized that microprinting, security threads, and watermarks weren't enough. North Korea had cracked them all, so to stop this operation once and for all, they had to hit it from the inside. Their first move was a public statement. For the past several years, the Secret Service has investigated a family of counterfeit notes. The sophisticated techniques utilized in the production of this family is evidence of a well-funded, ongoing criminal enterprise with a significant scientific and technical component. This family of counterfeit notes is emanating from North Korea. And while the press absorbed the headline, the FBI launched 2 covert operations: Operation Royal Charm on the East Coast and Operation Smoking Dragon on the West Coast. Over the next few years, undercover agents began infiltrating Chinese crime syndicates with ties to North Korea, slowly earning their trust, mapping the network, and collecting intelligence. And by 2005, the FBI finally had enough evidence to make arrests. So they coordinated a sting. Targets were invited to fake weddings and even a party at the Playboy Mansion. When their feet touched US soil, federal agents were waiting for them. The arrests spanned across America, Canada, Taiwan, and China. Hundreds of people with links to the operation were detained. But strangely, despite being certain they were masterminding the operation, the US had never arrested a single North Korean tied to the operation. You see, North Korean officials had been repeatedly caught moving large amounts of superdollars. That much is fact. But they always traveled with diplomatic passports. This meant they couldn't be arrested, and they weren't obligated to talk to local authorities. So in most cases, they were just sent home. North Korea, for its part, denied everything. They claimed their agents were only carrying cash because the US sanctions had locked them out of the global financial system. They said the allegations were political, and ultimately, the US couldn't prove otherwise. Behind the scenes, though, investigators kept following the money, and it always seemed to lead back to one place: Banco Delta Asia in Macau. The US believed the bank was laundering counterfeit cash and converting it into clean, spendable currency. In 2005, when the US declared Banco Delta Asia a primary money laundering concern, the Monetary Authority of Macau froze over $25 million tied to North Korean accounts. Much of that belonged to the country's ruling elite, so suddenly that money became leverage. The next year, North Korea claimed it would begin prosecuting counterfeiters, which, given the US's accusations, was deeply ironic. What's undeniable, though, is this: no new Superdollar variants have been discovered since 2008. With the criminal network dismantled and the laundering fronts frozen, presumably the operation became too difficult to sustain. But more likely, it simply became obsolete. By now, money was going digital, and in North Korea, the regime was starting to ask a different question. Why keep printing fake cash when you can just steal it? North Korea never truly recovered from the collapse of the Soviet Union and the devastating floods of 1995. Kim Jong-il had done little to revive the country's broken industries, so between 1990 and 2000, the economy had shrunk by more than 25%. And by 2006, the average North Korean only earned $1,108 each year, around 1/17th as much as the average South Korean. Throughout all this time, the regime had been relying on its near-perfect counterfeits of US bills to fund both the government and Kim Jong-il's luxurious private life. But after the FBI dismantled the Superdollar operation, North Korea found itself in a familiar position: broke, isolated, and desperate for foreign currency. Ironically, their next solution came from something the regime had always feared. In the mid-1990s, when the internet was just beginning to spread globally, Kim Jong-il made a very deliberate choice. He had just taken power, and the country was on the cusp of a devastating famine. If North Koreans could communicate with each other, or worse, with the outside world, they'd realize just how far behind they'd really fallen. To him, a connected population was a dangerous one. So by the mid-2000s, when the internet was revolutionizing countries all around the world, North Korea was not one of them. Rather than joining the global internet, they built a closed, government-controlled intranet, a tightly restricted system limited to state-approved educational content for select schools and institutions. Most citizens, however, couldn't even access it at all. To the outside world, this was just another example of a brutal regime controlling what its people could see, hear, and know. But beneath the surface, something much more sinister was going on. Because although North Koreans couldn't use the internet freely, they could still be trained to use it as a weapon. By the time North Korea's counterfeiting operation was shut down, they already had a small but growing team of highly trained cyber operatives to make money for the regime. They hadn't launched any attacks yet, but that was about to change. North Korea's first known cyber attack came in July of 2009. Over the course of a few days, Operation Troy, as it was later named, brought down dozens of American and South Korean government websites using a distributed denial of service attack, or DDoS for short. The technique is effective, but blunt. The hackers flooded the targeted websites with thousands of fake requests, overwhelming them with so much traffic that any regular person trying to use them simply couldn't. But as soon as the traffic stopped, the sites came back online. You see, DDoS attacks aren't technically considered hacking, because the websites weren't broken into, just overwhelmed with volume. In the years that followed, though, North Korea kept testing its capabilities. With every new target, their attacks became bolder, more sophisticated, until a few years later, they crossed a new line. On March 20th, 2013, 32,000 computers across 2 major South Korean banks and 3 of the country's largest TV broadcasters were suddenly shut down. The computers took weeks to repair, but by this point, South Korea had faced so many DDoS attacks that the story made headlines one day and was forgotten the next. Outside of Seoul, barely anyone noticed. But this time, something was different. South Korean investigators quickly discovered that this was no simple DDoS attack. The attackers had gone deeper, targeting the master boot record, or MBR, on each machine. The MBR is like a computer's ignition switch. It tells the machine how to turn on, where to find the operating system, and how to access its own memory. By corrupting it, the hackers hadn't just flooded websites. They had infiltrated thousands of computers, rewritten their code, and effectively bricked them. This operation became known as Dark Soul, and yet strangely, it didn't go further. The hackers didn't try to steal money. They didn't access classified files. They didn't paralyze South Korea's infrastructure. Investigators even found that the same techniques could have worked on South Korea's military systems. But instead, the hackers shut everything down and simply stopped. Perhaps they feared retaliation. Maybe they were still testing limits. Or maybe they had bigger plans. Either way, one thing was clear. When investigators analyzed the digital trail behind Operation Troy and the Dark Soul attacks, it always led back to North Korea. The regime's cyber warfare capabilities were no longer primitive. They were getting sharper, smarter, more precise, and much more ambitious. But for Kim Jong-un, North Korea's young, untested leader, the next strike wouldn't be strategic. It would be personal. When Kim Jong-il died in 2011, his youngest son, just 30 years old, was named North Korea's newest supreme leader. But Kim Jong-un had a problem. He wasn't the mythic war hero his grandfather was, or the seasoned statesman his father had become. He was young, inexperienced, and to many, he had a bit of a baby face. So to secure his grip on power, Kim crafted a new image. He painted himself as a visionary, a forward-thinking modernizer who would lead North Korea into a bold new era, not by returning to the past, but by embracing the future. This image wasn't just PR. For Kim, it was survival, because if the world laughed at him, or worse, his people, his grip on power could start to slip. So when news broke that a major Hollywood studio was producing a movie about literally assassinating him, he had no choice but to respond. In 2014, Sony Pictures Entertainment was gearing up for the release of The Interview, a comedy about 2 journalists recruited by the CIA to kill Kim Jong-un. To the filmmakers Seth Rogen and James Franco, it was just another comedy. And while Sony executives knew the plot was controversial, they gave it the green light. But to North Korea and its new supreme leader, this movie was beyond offensive. After Sony announced The Interview, North Korea's ambassador sent a letter to the United Nations, calling the film undisguised sponsoring of terrorism and an act of war. Sony thought it was an empty threat, so they made a few minor edits to the ending, but still pushed forward with the release. Seth Rogen and James Franco appeared on talk shows, making provocative statements.
The movie actually ends up being seen in North Korea. Could you imagine what would happen?
Yeah, I mean, I wonder what a North Korean citizen would think of the movie. I mean, they are not bad. They are the victims of a horrible situation. So part of me thinks that they themselves would really enjoy the movie.
What they didn't realize was that this satirical film was about to trigger what the FBI would call one of the most serious cyber attacks ever directed against the United States. On September 25, 2014, a Sony employee received an email about an upcoming advertising campaign. When he downloaded the attached files, it seemed like nothing out of the ordinary. But hidden deep inside the files were a few lines of malicious code, a secret back door into Sony's systems. This is a phishing attack, a classic technique where hackers send fake messages with infected files to trick people into downloading dangerous software. Over the following weeks, more fake emails made their way to Sony employees, which they opened. Cast and crew members of the interview received Facebook messages promising intimate photos of many A-list celebrities, which they opened. With each successful phishing attack, the hackers gained more and more access into Sony's systems. They operated like digital ghosts, watching everything while remaining invisible. And within 2 months, they stole approximately 38 million files, unreleased movies, confidential emails, employee data, salary information, even private medical records. Sony had no idea what was coming. A month before the release of the interview, several Sony executives received a strange email from someone calling themselves Frank David. It read, "We've got great damage by Sony Pictures. The compensation for it? Monetary compensation we want. Pay the damage, or Sony Pictures will be bombarded as a whole. You know us very well. We never wait long. You'd better behave wisely." The executives dismissed this as nonsense, and for a few weeks, nothing happened. But on November 24th, when Sony's employees turned their computers on in the morning, instead of their usual login screen, they saw this: a blood-red skeleton with menacing eyes and a message. "We've already warned you, and this is just the beginning. We've obtained all your internal data, including your secrets and top secrets." The message was signed #GOP, Guardians of Peace. At first, some employees thought it was some sort of prank. But within hours, the true scale of the disaster became painfully clear. Emails vanished in real time. Phone lines went dead. One by one, computers froze and shut down across the company. Sony's IT team scrambled to cut devices off the network, but it was too late. The attack was so thorough that the CEO of Sony Pictures had to use an old phone that he had found at home. Executives communicated with their personal Gmail accounts, and employees lined up in the parking lot to receive handwritten paychecks. Even the studio cafe couldn't process credit card payments. In a single day, one of Hollywood's most powerful studios had been thrown back to the Stone Age, and the hackers were just getting started. 5 days after the breach, several media outlets received anonymous emails with links to stolen Sony data.
In an attack by very sophisticated hackers who are serving the interests of, yes, one of America's greatest enemies.
But the hackers were strategic. Instead of releasing the files all at once, they started by leaking movies that hadn't hit theaters yet, which caused immediate financial damage to Sony. But it was nothing more than a warning. In early December, they released Sony's financial records, including the salaries of every top executive and major Hollywood star working with the studio. The leaks revealed massive pay gaps between men and women, white employees and those of color, so social media exploded with comments attacking Sony. But with their communication systems down, coordinating a response was nearly impossible. And days after that, they released approximately 5,000 emails from Amy Pascal, Sony's second-in-command and one of the most powerful women in Hollywood. She'd called Angelina Jolie a talentless, spoiled brat, and joked about how President Obama probably only watched movies with black leads. Meanwhile, nearly 4,000 current and former Sony employees had their private information exposed. Everything from social security numbers to medical records and performance reviews. But on December 16, 2014, the hackers published a message that turned this from a corporate hack into something much worse. Warning: We will clearly show it to you at the very time and places the interview be shown, including the premiere. How bitter fate those who seek fun and terror should be doomed to. Soon all the world will see what an awful movie Sony Pictures Entertainment has made. The world will be full of fear. Remember the 11th of September 2001. We recommend you to keep yourself distant from the places at that time. This was a direct threat of mass violence, and it changed everything.
This is a story that we're going to be checking on today, whether or not local theaters plan to cancel their showing of the film The Interview.
When major theater chains began announcing that they wouldn't be screening The Interview, Sony faced an impossible choice. Continue with the release and risk lives, or cancel the film and give in to terrorists. The next day, they canceled the film's worldwide release, and the backlash was immediate. Critics and celebrities called Sony's decision a defeat against terrorism and an attack on free speech. Even President Obama weighed in.
We cannot have a society in which some dictator someplace can start imposing censorship here in the United States.
Eventually, Sony caved to the pressure and decided to release The Interview in a select number of theaters. But it flopped. The Interview was unprofitable. The employees whose data was leaked filed a class action lawsuit, and Amy Pascal resigned months later. Altogether, the hack cost Sony up to an estimated $200 million. But while the media focused on the film's controversy, behind the scenes, the FBI had been hunting for the attackers. On December 19th, after analyzing the malware and following the digital trail the hackers left behind, they publicly blamed North Korea for the attack. President Obama confirmed it.
And we can confirm that North Korea engaged in this attack.
This was a stunning announcement. Never before had the U.S. government so quickly accused another nation of a specific cyber attack.
Yes, I think they
Of course, North Korea denied everything. They called the accusation a grave political provocation and suggested the hack was the righteous deed of the supporters and sympathizers of North Korea. But the evidence against them was compelling. The hackers had reused the code from past campaigns. They'd reused email addresses and social media accounts from other North Korean operations. And most tellingly, the same IP addresses linked to Operation Troy and the Dark Soul attacks were used to access Sony's servers and set up Facebook and Gmail accounts. The hackers from these campaigns went by different pseudonyms. The Who Is Team, the New Romantic Cyber Army. This time, it was the Guardians of Peace. But by now, the pattern was unmistakable. These groups were one and the same. A single, well-funded, state-sponsored cyber army operating out of North Korea. Going forward, they would be known by one name: the Lazarus Group. However, the most alarming thing the investigators found wasn't just how advanced they were. It was the pattern. Each attack was bigger, more ambitious, more dangerous. The Sony hack proved what the Lazarus Group was capable of, but for all the chaos they caused, they didn't make any money, which meant their next target was inevitable: the global banking system itself. On the morning of February 6, 2016, the employees at the Central Bank of Bangladesh were dealing with what seemed like an annoying little problem. This was now the second day their printer wasn't working. Every time they tried to print a transaction report, the information was blank. At first, they shrugged it off as just another annoying office problem, but it wasn't. When someone finally gave the printer a hard reset, it began spewing out all the messages from its backlog. But this was not a moment of relief. Most of the messages came from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Over the last day and a half, while the printer was down, someone had tried to drain Bangladesh Bank's entire account. No one at the bank had approved any transactions. No one knew who had sent them or how. All they knew was $951 million had been transferred out, and now the money was moving fast. Bangladesh was now at the center of one of the most audacious cyber heists the world had ever seen. How did this happen? A year earlier, an employee at the Bangladesh Bank's Human Resources Department received an email from someone named Razel Alam. It was a standard job application, with a link to Alam's website where his resume could be downloaded. The employee did. They reviewed the application and continued with their day. But hidden inside that resume was a piece of malware called Nest Egg. This was another phishing attack, the first step in a carefully orchestrated breach. Without being detected, Nest Egg gave the hackers control over the employee's computer, as well as persistent access to it even if they turned it off. But just being inside the bank's systems wasn't enough. Human Resources didn't have access to any funds, so the hackers needed to traverse the bank's network until they found the machine that did. And that meant navigating a complex, unfamiliar network without getting caught. To do this, the hackers deployed two other tools. The first one, Sierra Charlie, was designed to sweep an infected computer for saved passwords, logins, anything useful. With that, the hackers could then find other computers that were connected to it and break into them. But that came with a risk. Too much suspicious traffic, and the bank's IT department might catch on. So the hackers launched MacTruck, their most sophisticated piece of malware yet. MacTruck created a shadow network within the bank, a separate, encrypted communication channel that allowed the hackers to send commands and information between compromised machines. And it did it all without leaving a trace. Once a less important computer served its purpose, MacTruck deleted everything the hackers had done there. It wiped the malware, the activity logs. It was as if they'd never even been there. The hackers infiltrated hundreds of computers, but at any given moment, they were only inside a handful. Eventually, they found what they were looking for. The computers connected to the SWIFT terminal, the platform used by banks around the world to communicate with each other and send massive financial transfers. The SWIFT terminal gave the hackers access to the Bangladesh bank's funds, but there was a problem. Even if they managed to send the money out, there was no guarantee it would stay out. This was because Bangladesh Bank kept an internal database of its SWIFT transactions. Employees could check it at any time, and if someone noticed a suspicious outgoing transfer, they could simply contact the recipient bank and request a reversal. To pull off the heist, the hackers had to make sure no one at the bank ever saw the money leave. And to do that, they targeted the database that stored the internal SWIFT logs. Accessing this system required credentials, but the hackers rewrote the login code itself so that no matter what they typed, they'd still be granted full access. Now, whenever the hackers sent a transfer, they could instantly log in and erase any trace of what they'd done. At almost any other bank, this would have been enough to initiate the heist. But in Bangladesh, the hackers still had one more obstacle: the printer. You see, by 2016, most modern banks had gone fully digital, but the Bangladesh bank still physically printed their SWIFT transaction reports and messages. Each time a transfer happened, they would print a physical report with the amount, the recipient, the timestamp, everything. And each time another bank contacted them, asking, for example, to confirm a transfer, they would print the message out. All of this happened automatically, so even if the hackers deleted their digital trail, the printer would expose them. Instead of completely disabling the printer, the hackers did something smarter. They rewrote the part of the SWIFT software that generated reports and messages, so that any actual data was automatically replaced with zeros. The printer kept working, technically, but because there was no data coming into it, every report it produced was blank. No amounts, no destinations, just a shell of a document. This is why the printer was malfunctioning. Nearly 1 year after the hackers had infiltrated the Central Bank of Bangladesh, all the pieces for the perfect heist were in their place. Now they just had to wait for the perfect moment. The transfers began just a few minutes after the bank's employees left work on February 4th, 2016, at 8:36 p.m. It was a Thursday. In Bangladesh, a predominantly Muslim country, weekends are on Fridays and Saturdays, which meant the bank's employees wouldn't be back until Sunday morning. But in New York, it was 9:36 a.m., which meant the Federal Reserve had all of Thursday and Friday to process the transfers. Of course, when the Fed received instructions to drain Bangladesh's entire account, they were concerned. Using the SWIFT system, they contacted the Bangladesh bank for clarification, but since the printer was offline, nobody saw the messages. It wasn't until Saturday afternoon that Bangladesh finally reset the machine, and the missing messages began to pour out. Bangladesh Bank immediately tried to contact the Fed, but by that point it was already the weekend in New York. Their offices were closed, and the money was gone. To make things even worse, the hackers were sending the stolen funds to the Philippines, and that was a very intentional choice. Contacting a Philippine bank on a Sunday was already impossible, and Monday, February 8th, was the start of the Lunar New Year, a massive public holiday across much of Asia, which gave the hackers an extra day to move the money with no oversight. By juggling 3 different time zones, 3 different countries, and 3 different cultures, the hackers had stretched a simple weekend into a 5-day window of opportunity. They had just robbed Bangladesh of $951 million. Now, they just had to get away with it. But that didn't go exactly as planned. The hackers had spent months preparing for this moment, but ultimately, the heist fell apart because of 2 things: a mistake and a coincidence. Making international transfers isn't as simple as sending money from Bank A to Bank B. Even within the SWIFT network, most banks don't have a direct connection to each other, so you need to specify intermediary banks to route the money through. Of the 35 transactions the hackers attempted initially, they only did this in one of them. In that transaction, the hackers sent $20 million to a Sri Lankan NGO called the Shalika Foundation. But when the intermediary bank was reviewing the transfer, they saw that the word foundation was misspelled. This was the hacker's mistake, a simple typo. Because of this, the intermediary bank flagged the transaction as suspicious, contacted Bangladesh Bank days later, and when they confirmed the transfer wasn't authorized, the money was returned. However, that still left $931 million left for them to steal. After 34 of their first 35 transfers were denied, the hackers were quick to resubmit them correctly. This time they were sending the money to the Philippines, specifically to a bank called RCBC, where they'd opened 4 personal accounts under fake names, each seated with just 500 Philippine pesos. But this is where they were hit with a coincidence. The address of the RCBC branch where the hackers had opened the accounts was Jupiter Street. And completely unrelated to any of this, Jupiter was also the name of an Iranian shipping vessel that the United States had sanctioned. When the Federal Reserve's anti-money laundering systems saw the word Jupiter in the transfer requests, it triggered an alert. Suddenly, the Fed was forced to review all 34 transactions manually. Between that unlikely coincidence, the large sums involved, and the fact that the money was being sent to individuals instead of businesses or institutions, only 4 of these 34 transactions made it to the Philippines. From there, the money was moved to a single account, sent to a money-changing firm where it was converted into Philippine pesos and shuffled inside casinos, which at the time were not subject to anti-money laundering laws. In the end, of the $951 million Bangladesh held in the Federal Reserve, the hackers managed to steal $81 million. The Bangladesh bank heist was officially attributed to the Lazarus Group. Investigators found that the same IP addresses, the same phishing infrastructure, and even some of the exact same malware used in the Sony hack, Operation Troy, and Dark Soul had all shown up again. By now, the Lazarus Group had learned that you don't need guns or armies to rob a country. But the next time they struck, they didn't just target a single country or institution. They targeted everyone. 3D videos like this take countless hours to create, and rendering can take even longer. The only reason we're able to produce work at this level is thanks to Superliminal, the fastest and most affordable render farm on the market. With multiple GPUs powering every render simultaneously, we were able to work fast, efficiently, and in real time. If you're in 3D production, don't waste time waiting. Use the same tool that made this video possible. Go to Sulu/Cipher. On the morning of May 12, 2017, something strange began happening inside several hospitals in London. Across the city, computer screens went black. Suddenly, CT scanners and MRI machines stopped working. Non-critical patients were turned away. Hundreds of cancer patients had their treatments delayed, and even ongoing surgeries had to be improvised without access to digital records. Suddenly, the screens turned red and a chilling message appeared. Oops, your files have been encrypted. Maybe you're busy looking for a way to recover your files, but do not waste your time. Nobody can recover your files without our decryption service. Below that was a drop-down menu offering payment instructions in 28 different languages. The attackers demanded several $100s paid in Bitcoin to unlock the machine. If the ransom wasn't paid within 3 days, it would double. After a week, the data would be deleted forever. But this wasn't just happening in hospitals, and it wasn't just happening in London. Across the entire planet, from German railway companies to Russian banks and X, thousands of people were seeing the same red screen. By the end of the day, over 230,000 Windows computers in more than 150 countries had been infected. It was one of the largest ransomware attacks in history. But how do you hack 230,000 computers in a day? Every computer has something called ports, digital doorways that allow machines to communicate over a network. If a port is open, other computers in the same network can send it information. One of those ports, port 445, is often open by default. On some machines, it's even public-facing on the World Wide Web, which means anyone can send code directly to it if they know how. Now, most malware requires someone to open a bad file or click a dangerous link, but this was a virus. As soon as it infected a device, it scanned its entire network for other vulnerable machines and jumped to them through port 445. It replicated itself again and again and again, and the more interconnected a network was, the better it worked. That's why the UK's National Health Service was one of the hardest hit. The virus spread like wildfire for months, and once it was activated, it did something deceptively simple. It used a modified version of Windows' own encryption tool called WannaCry to encrypt every file on a computer. But unlike normal encryption, the decryption key wasn't stored on the device. The hackers had it, and if you wanted your files back, you had to pay. Instead of WannaCry, the hackers called it WannaCry. A twisted joke maybe, but lives were on the line. When news of the WannaCry virus was spreading across the world, Marcus Hutchins, a 22-year-old computer geek in a quiet seaside town in southwest England, was watching everything unfold. Hutchins ran a modest cybersecurity blog under the alias Malware Tech. He'd become known in the online community for his detailed breakdowns of new viruses and exploits. That Friday, Hutchins downloaded the WannaCry code and started analyzing it. almost immediately, he noticed something strange. Just before infecting a new victim, WannaCry would try to ping a website with a long, random domain name that clearly hadn't been registered. If the website was offline, the virus would execute, encrypting the computer's files, demanding the ransom, and then scanning for more machines to infect. But if the website was online, the virus wouldn't do anything. When Hutchins looked up the domain name, he was surprised to find that no one owned it. So he bought it for £10. He put it on a live server, and just like that, the WannaCry outbreak was over. Why such an obvious vulnerability was built into the code is still unclear. Most experts believe it was a leftover failsafe to kill the virus if it ever escaped in testing. But now it had brought the real attack down. Almost overnight, Hutchins went from anonymous blogger to global hero. He gained tens of thousands of new followers, news outlets published his story, and a local restaurant offered him free pizza for a year. But you see, something about Marcus Hutchins didn't quite add up. Years before WannaCry, Hutchins had secretly partnered with a cybercriminal on the dark web to create a piece of banking malware. So just weeks after he stopped the WannaCry virus, he was arrested by the FBI. However, instead of facing a decade in prison, Hutchins walked free. Because he'd also helped stop one of history's largest cyber attacks, the cybersecurity community raised enough funds to pay his bail, and the judge let him off without a sentence. As the NSA and FBI began digging deeper into the WannaCry code, they found that it had originated from an unlikely place, the United States. Years earlier, the NSA had discovered the same Port 445 vulnerability, but instead of disclosing it, they kept it for themselves. Eventually, though, that tool escaped into the wild. It ended up in a leak where various stolen NSA tools were sold on dark web forums to whoever would pay. Once it was out, it was only a matter of time before it ended up in the hands of North Korea. All signs pointed to the Lazarus Group. Now, despite infecting over 230,000 computers, WannaCry only earned a few $100,000 for the regime. Not exactly a jackpot, but what stood out was how they handled the money. Victims were told to send Bitcoin to one of 3 wallet addresses. Since all blockchain transactions are public, investigators could trace their transactions, all the way to an exchange called HitBTC. HitBTC turned the stolen Bitcoin into regular money, and once the hackers withdrew it, it vanished. In the Bangladesh heist, laundering the stolen money involved moving truckloads full of cash, gambling rings, and a complex international network of fixers. It took months of planning and months of execution. This time, it took 48 hours, and it was all done from a computer. Some investigators believe WannaCry wasn't a disappointment, but a test. The Lazarus Group had now learned how to launder cryptocurrency, and they were about to make the most of that skill. If your goal is to steal money through cybercrime, there's no better tool than cryptocurrency. Unlike traditional financial systems, it's borderless, anonymous, and decentralized. So in the years following WannaCry, the Lazarus Group shifted its focus from banks and old-school espionage and set their sights on digital gold. First came NiceHash in 2017. With nothing more than a stolen VPN password, the hackers drained $75 million from the platform's Bitcoin wallet in a matter of hours. In 2020, they obtained the private keys to several KuCoin wallets. Before anyone noticed, $275 million had vanished. In 2022, they breached Axie Infinity, a crypto-based game with millions of users. By compromising their internal permissions, they transferred over $600 million out of the bridge that linked the game to the Ethereum blockchain. In 2023, they extracted private keys stored on Stake.com servers and walked away with $41 million. And in 2024, they exploited a flaw in Wazir X's backend API and quietly siphoned $230 million in crypto. If you add up every cryptocurrency theft ever publicly attributed to North Korea from 2017 to 2024, the total surpasses $6 billion. And considering how much the value those coins may have appreciated since the time of the attacks, the real amount could be much higher. Still, the most worrying part about the Lazarus Group's crypto heists isn't just how much they've stolen, it's how quickly they've evolved. In just a few years, they went from crude phishing emails to custom spyware, multi-layered money laundering schemes, and coordinated exploits of decentralized infrastructure. Now they were ready for their biggest, most complex, most ambitious attack to date. On the 4th of February 2025, a senior safe wallet developer received what appeared to be an exciting career opportunity. A recruiter had reached out to him on LinkedIn about a promising new job. As part of the interview, he was asked to complete a technical coding challenge. It came as a downloadable file, something called a Docker project, which developers use to test code in a contained environment, without having to install anything manually. The developer downloaded it, opened it, and began working, just like he would with any other project. But what he didn't realize was that hidden inside this container was malicious code that gave hackers remote access to his computer, which crucially had access to SafeWallet's internal infrastructure on Amazon Web Services. However, the hackers didn't try to crack the developer's password or break through his multi-factor authentication. Instead, they did something far more sophisticated. You see, Amazon Web Services login uses temporary session tokens, short-term credentials that are automatically generated when a user logs in and expire after about 12 hours. The hacker's malware was silently copying these tokens the moment they were created. This way, they didn't need to break the security. They were simply using the developer's legitimate access while he was still logged in. From there, they quietly explored SafeWallet's cloud systems and wrote a simple yet devastating piece of code. All it took was changing a 0 to a 1. Now all they had to do was wait. On February 17th, Ben Zhou, co-founder of Bybit, the second largest cryptocurrency exchange by volume, began a routine transfer. The goal was simple: move Ethereum from an offline cold wallet to an online warm wallet for active trading on the exchange. Zhou and multiple other authorized signers reviewed the transaction using SafeWallet. Everything looked right, so Zhou checked the wallet address one final time and clicked approve. But this was what the hacker's malware had been waiting for. At the exact moment Zhou approved the transaction, he activated a piece of malicious code written into SafeWallet's user interface. Buried deep inside the transaction data was a field called Operation. It had been silently switched from 0 to 1. That tiny change gave the attackers complete control over Bybit's wallet, and its funds were quickly sent to an external, unauthorized address. Bybit security systems instantly detected that one of their cold wallets was emptied, but before they even had time to react, the hackers were already covering their tracks. They immediately removed every trace of their presence from the developer's computer, including their activity logs and the malicious JavaScript code they'd written. 30 minutes after the theft was discovered, Bybit released a statement to their millions of users. Nearly 1.5 billion in Ethereum had been stolen from one of the biggest crypto exchanges in the world. And yet, there was one thing the hackers couldn't delete: the blockchain itself. After Bybit's statement, the biggest crypto security investigators began tracing the stolen funds. It didn't take long. The wallet addresses receiving Bybit's stolen funds were not random. They were the same ones used just a month earlier to launder money from the Femex exchange hack. Following this, the FBI made a public announcement. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is releasing this PSA to advise the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, North Korea, was responsible for the theft of approximately 1.5 billion USD in virtual assets from cryptocurrency exchange Bybit on or about February 21, 2025. Only the Lazarus Group could have been behind this, and they weren't wasting any time laundering this money. The stolen funds came in the form of Ethereum utility tokens. But the problem with these was that unlike pure ETH, these issuers could freeze the wallets with the click of a button. So the first thing the hackers did was convert their stolen tokens into Ethereum itself, which has no central authority. Once converted, the hackers split the stolen tokens across 50 different wallets, each holding roughly 10,000 ETH. This was done through decentralized exchanges with automated trading protocols. This way, no one could freeze their accounts, and the money would never stop moving. However, the transparency of blockchain technology meant that every transaction was publicly visible and permanently recorded. To buy themselves time, the hackers used a mixing service, where their funds were sent through hundreds of wallets, different blockchains, and mixed with thousands of other users' cryptocurrencies to create an impossibly complex web of transactions and return clean Bitcoin with no connection to the original theft. It was one of the most sophisticated laundering operations in crypto history. To this day, 62% of all the stolen funds have disappeared. 33% remain traceable, and 5%, just 72.45 million, have been frozen. All in all, North Korea walked away from the Bybit hack with at least $868 million. The scale of the heist and the technical complexity involved make this the largest and most serious crypto hack in recent memory. North Korea's unwillingness to address the international law enforcement community's accusations seriously makes one thing clear: the Lazarus Group isn't done. Because at the helm of this operation is a sovereign dictatorship, one with a nuclear arsenal, a boundless appetite for luxury, and a broken economy in desperate need of foreign currency. A former North Korean computer science professor who defected to the South estimates the regime has around 6,000 so-called cyber warriors, tasked with generating income for the regime. He put it simply: for North Korea, the cyber army is the most important because it is asymmetric. It can operate with a small number of people and equipment while obtaining significant results. Many experts now consider the Lazarus Group the most sophisticated criminal enterprise in modern history. But even after all of these devastating attacks, one piece of the puzzle remains unsolved. How does North Korea, so isolated and impoverished, develop hackers this skilled? For all the damage the Lazarus Group has caused, this perhaps is the most disturbing part of their entire operation. It's tempting to view North Korea's cyber attacks as the work of evil geniuses, operating in some underground bunker, pulling off billion-dollar heists from behind glowing screens. Unfortunately, the truth is far more complex and far more human. Imagine a boy growing up in North Korea in the mid-1990s. He remembers the moment rice ran out in his village, hunting dragonflies for food in the summer, and realizing early on that help would never come. But the boy has a gift. Numbers come easily to him, so he keeps his head down, gets perfect grades, and waits. One day, a government official visits his school, reviews a list of the top students, and he is invited to a special education program with advanced math classes. He excels. At age 12, he travels abroad to the International Mathematical Olympiad. For a brief moment, he gets to see the outside world. When he returns to North Korea, the boy begins intensive training in computer science. He's sent to one of Pyongyang's top universities, where he studies programming, encryption, and network security. He's not alone. Thousands of gifted children across the country are on the same path. Only a handful will make it through the final selection. The most brilliant and most loyal are absorbed into one of two elite programs, North Korea's nuclear weapons program, or its cyber army. The boy, now a young man, is an exceptionally talented student, and he shows great loyalty to the Kim dynasty. He is chosen for the cyber army and stationed in China. Once inside the system, he's treated as a soldier in the North Korean military, where he participates in cyber heists to generate income for the North Korean regime. He is isolated from the rest of the country. He lives in a cramped apartment with a group of other young men just like him. It's a covert operation, closely monitored by government handlers. He is woken at 6 a.m. and forced to work for 15 to 20 hours a day. Like the rest of his unit, he's required to steal at least $10,000 every year. Almost all of it goes back to Pyongyang. He keeps just enough to survive. But being a hacker comes with a unique privilege. He has access to the open internet. Inside North Korea, information is tightly restricted. But if he's going to craft convincing phishing emails and trick software engineers into downloading malware, he needs to understand their culture. The young man lives inside a paradox, isolated from society, yet immersed in its culture. Gaming forums, banking apps, pop culture, even celebrity scandals. He watches movies that will be banned in his country. He reads the news. He sees the wealth and freedom other people enjoy. He knows his government lied to him. He knows about the famines, the propaganda, the corruption, and he sees with crystal clarity just how far behind his country truly is. But despite this, there is simply no opting out. Refusing to follow orders can mean prison, torture, or worse. Defection is nearly impossible. Even if he succeeds, his parents, grandparents, and perhaps even his children would suffer the consequences. In North Korea, the sins of an individual extend to his family, and they must be repaid by 3 generations after him. And despite everything he's seen, at the end of the day, North Korea is still his home. But even in this tightly controlled system, the cyber army offers something else for the young man: hope. North Korean society is strictly hierarchical. Using a system called songbun, the regime determines everything, from a citizen's food rations to their education to where they're allowed to live. They classify its people in 3 main castes: core, wavering, and hostile, each with dozens of subcategories. Since songbun is based on your family's history of loyalty to the Kim dynasty, moving up is almost impossible. But there are a few exceptions. If you excel in sports, in the arts, or in computer science. Life as a hacker is grueling and morally dubious, but for the young man, it comes with better rations, better housing, even the chance for his family to relocate to a better part of Pyongyang. So he stays. He keeps working. He lives a strange kind of double life, one foot in the 21st century, the other trapped in a brutal dictatorship, doing its dirty work. He sees the truth, but he's learned to look away. He is a skilled programmer, a loyal soldier, and a prisoner, in all but name. The Lazarus Group's operatives aren't evil masterminds. They're brilliant kids, handpicked from childhood, trained with military discipline, and trapped in a system that gives them no real choice. Their talents could have built companies, cured diseases, or advanced science. Instead, they are weaponized, forced to serve a corrupt regime that exploits them for the preservation of their own power. It's a tragedy, but when it comes to North Korea, nothing is ever as simple as the good guys and the bad guys. Throughout this video, we've seen a dangerous pattern. Year by year, the Lazarus Group's attacks get bigger, bolder, and more sophisticated. The question isn't if they will continue hacking. They've only just begun. The question is, what comes next?